Thank you so much. And I deeply appreciate the opportunity to share with you the public opinion findings from various American public opinion pollsters in the run up to our election, which is now a week from tomorrow, our time, a week from today, your time. And I know from my experience in Japan that the outcome of the US election is terribly, terribly important, not only to the American people, but also to the Japanese people. As I like to joke, uh, the American elections are ultimately very unfair. We get to vote, but you have to live with the consequences. And so I look forward to your questions and comments after my presentation. But just as an aside, for those of you who are watching this presentation as opposed to watching Shohei Ohtani play in the American World Series, Ohtani walked in the first inning and scored a run. So he seems to be doing well for the Dodgers in the World Series game that's going on as we speak. So, with that, I'd like to begin the presentation. First off, what are American voters worried about, concerned about as they head to the polls in the coming week? A record high percentage of Americans are dissatisfied with the direction of the country. They think that the country is on the wrong track. And among pollsters, this is considered one of the most important and telling public opinion findings in the sense that it tends to predict outcomes of elections quite often. As you can see, there was a rising discontent at the end of the Trump administration, and Biden got elected. There was a rising discontent at the end of the George W. Bush administration, and Obama got elected. But I do want to caution you that, as you can see from this chart, in 28 of the last 36 years, Americans have said the country was in the wrong direction. In fact, the last time Americans thought we were in the right direction was in 2002, about a generation ago. So I do think that while this finding may, in fact, help predict the outcome of the election, it also reflects something much more profound, much deeper concern among the American public, which we can get into later. But it does suggest that there's a level of dissatisfaction that I would argue probably transcends reality, and something deeper is going on. Um, Half the country believes that today uh, they're less well off than they were 4 years ago. They were better off 4 years ago. Um, that again is a theme of this election. Candidate Trump repeatedly returns to this and asks the voters, do you feel better than you did 4 years ago? And basically, people say, no, I don't feel better. Um, this clashes with the underlying reality of the economy, at least, where you have a record high stock market, you have quite low unemployment, you have declining inflation, and yet people believe they were better off under Donald Trump, where it's not at all clear they were. But that's what they feel, and people vote on their feelings and not on maybe the facts that they don't understand or don't want to acknowledge. So this is again a very telling finding. Republicans and Democrats differ greatly on what they think is important and what are the important issues facing them in this election. Republicans believe it's the economy, it's immigration, it's national security and terrorism. Democrats are much more likely to say it's the future of the American democracy that's at stake. They are very frustrated with the Supreme Court and some of the recent decisions, and abortion, and a woman's right to have access to abortion are the biggest issues for Democratic voters. Um, as I mentioned, immigration and abortion really do divide the electorate. A majority of Americans back mass deportation for undocumented immigrants, and a majority, similar majority really, back access to abortion. And in many ways, this may determine the outcome of which voters who have these concerns are likely to turn up and vote in the biggest numbers. Um, Women in particular are very concerned about a woman's right to control her own body and to decide if she can have an abortion and not have the government dictate that. Whereas the concern about undocumented people in the country is very high, even among Democrats. Um, what I must say I find most concerning, disturbing, is that you have a majority of the public saying they support mass deportation. Just to put that in context, there are 11 million undocumented, an estimated 11 million undocumented people in the United States. This is 100 times larger than the number of Japanese Americans we incarcerated at the beginning of World War II. And that is a black spot on our memory. That's a black spot on our history. It's one of the most horrific abuses of human rights ever made by the United States in modern times. And uh, a majority of the public wants to round up 11 million people. To round up 11 million people, you'd have to create a police state. But Donald Trump keeps promising to do that. We'll see if he does, if he's elected. But it has the support of a majority of the public, not just a majority of Republicans. Um, you probably have read or heard that the United States is deeply polarized between Republicans and Democrats. Um, I submit to you that however polarized you think America is, it's actually worse than that. Um, Republicans and Democrats disagree on almost everything. Um, when I was at the Pew Research Center, we periodically asked people where would they like to live, and Republicans wanted to live in big houses with a big yard, even if you had to drive to everything. And Democrats wanted to live or were willing to live in smaller houses on a smaller yard if they could walk to certain things. Think about what that means is that your Republicans and Democrats are self-segregating themselves into two separate communities where you're unlikely to encounter anyone in your daily routine who thinks differently than you do. And this only reinforces the partisanship. As you can see here, there's a 51 percentage point difference on how Republicans and Democrats think about climate change. There's a 43 percentage point differences on immigration, a 32 percentage point difference on abortion. So on these leading policy issues, there are huge differences of opinion along partisan lines. But in many ways, the cultural polarization, the the polarization around cultural issues is, if anything, worse. It's a 71 percentage point difference on how people feel about guns. There is a 56 percentage point difference over how people feel about the legacy of slavery, and a 53 percentage point difference over questions surrounding sexual identity. And James Carville, a very famous American political advisor for Bill Clinton, once coined the phrase, "It's the economy, stupid." And he's absolutely right. The economy is a very important indicator of how people are going to vote. But it does seem to me now this data suggests it's also culture stupid, that people just have different views of what is appropriate for American culture. Um, Nearly half of Republicans and a quarter of Democrats say they want a strong leader unencumbered by the courts or Congress. To my mind, this is one of the telling signs of the threat to American democracy, because a president who is unencumbered by the courts and Congress is, by any other definition, a dictator. And there seems to be significant support for a dictator among the voters. I think the explanation is it's because people feel that democracy and the way it is functioning is not delivering for them, is not producing the results they anticipated or want. Uh, but it does suggest that people are willing to give up their democratic freedoms and their democratic rights in the hope that some other system, a dictatorial system, an authoritarian system, would be better at solving their problems. But when you drill down and you ask people specific questions about what they mean about by their support for a president who's unencumbered by the courts or Congress, you see majority support among both Republicans and Democrats for governing by executive order, executive action. This is the height of undemocratic behavior, because it says if the Congress can't approve something, the president can just go ahead and issue an order. One of the many complications of that, over and above the fact that it's not democracy with a small d, is that an executive order in the American system can be overturned on day one of your successors, your following president's inauguration. So it's very disruptive to business and very disruptive to the public in general, that you come to expect a certain behavior, and then you have an election, and that whole behavior is overturned. So, but a majority of Republicans and Democrats would support a greater use of executive action. And bear in mind that Obama issued more executive orders than Bush did. Trump issued more executive orders than Obama did. Biden has issued more executive orders than Trump did. This is a trend that's been growing. In addition, Trump has promised to use federal law enforcement officials to investigate his political opponents in the other party. The majority of Republicans support that. Trump has promised to fire 50,000 civil servants, people who have their jobs by merit, not by political connections. And 4 in 10 Republicans support that. And 4 in 10 Republicans say that the president should be able to pardon his friends and family or political supporters who've been convicted of a crime. So again, there's this tendency to move towards a strong leader who is unencumbered by the law. Now, obviously, there are international concerns that could grow out of this, the results of this election, whoever wins. You and Japan obviously are very worried about what the Americans may want or do after the election. Um, the backdrop to this is that Americans are less and less satisfied with the US position in the world. As you can see, the satisfaction among Americans with the US position in the world peaked at the end of the Clinton administration. And it has fallen off dramatically since then. Um, I think this can be explained in a number of different ways, but I think the way that I find most convincing to me is that Americans are having real trouble accepting the fact that America is in relative decline. When you use the word decline, Americans get very upset. We're not in decline. That's a horrible idea. And Donald Trump is going to make America great again. But the important word in that sentence is relative. America is no longer the only superpower in the world. America has grown. We still have the biggest military, we still have the biggest economy, but compared with the 1940s, the late 1940s, when Japan was flat on its back, Europe was flat on its back, uh, we now have to compete with China, with Japan, with Europe. There are other major actors in the world besides the United States. So we are relatively not as powerful as we once were. And I think this is what has caused the dissatisfaction among Americans. They're having real trouble adjusting to the fact that we live in a multipolar world with other major players, and this is probably one reason why, especially among Republicans, you see a rise in isolationism. Um, for those of you who followed U.S. politics for many years, as you can see to the left-hand part of this graph, it was Democrats who were slightly isolationist before Donald Trump. But now it is Republicans who are significantly more isolate, more than twice as isolationist as Democrats. Um, so there has been a real shift here. And in part, it has been because of the amplification of these isolationist sentiments by Donald Trump, both as president and then as a candidate this year. Um, Maybe even more disturbing, it seems to me, is that 8 in 10 Harris supporters back compromise with with the U.S. allies, but only 4 in 10 Trump supporters agree with compromise. I think this is a residue of this idea that uh, we shouldn't be in relative decline. We should be absolutely the most powerful in the world without anyone we have to cooperate with because we run the world. That's obviously not real anymore. And Trump supporters, especially, have, I think, great difficulty doing this. As you can see, they believe, 3/4 of them believe, that the U.S. should pursue policies to keep America as the only military superpower, not just one of the military super, but the only military superpower. That, my personal view is, that's wholly unrealistic. That's unattainable, but that's what they believe. And I think it's because they want to go back to a time when that was the case. When Donald Trump says, make America great again, he's talking in part about making America the only major superpower in the world and the one that can dictate to everyone else what is done. On specific issues, which are clearly important in this election, on Ukraine, for example, by 2 to 1, voters now believe that the U.S. should push for a negotiated settlement in Ukraine. This was not the case a year ago. I think the American public is tired of this war that seems to go on and has no end in sight. Bear in mind that it took 6 months for the US Congress this year to pass an aid bill for Ukraine. I dare say it could take longer next year if the US Congress could do that at all. And if Donald Trump is president, I don't think that's going to be possible because he says he's going to end the war on day one, which is a bit much to expect. But I do think that we know that Republicans in Congress already say that they hear from at least half of their voters that those voters think we give too much to Ukraine already. So getting to give more to Ukraine, I think, is going to be a very uphill struggle. Um, the war in Gaza goes on. It's now expanded to Lebanon. What's interesting is that Americans' sympathy for Israel has actually rebounded in the last few months. As you can see, it was quite strong right after October the 7th, understandably so. As the Gaza war unfolded and the photographs of people being killed in Gaza and the numbers mounting, the support for the Israeli effort in Gaza went down. It has now rebounded. I can't explain it. The only explanation I can think of is that Americans, like probably many people, like to be associated with a winner. And Israel seems predominant right now in Gaza, in Lebanon, even in its face off with Iran. And Americans like to be associated with a winner. That may explain this rebound. I just don't know. One thing we do know, however, which should trouble the Israelis a great deal, is that support for Israel among younger Americans keeps going down and down and down. The support for Israel is still stronger than its support for the Palestinians among young Americans, but the gap is narrowed dramatically. And what I've said to Israeli officials is that they are losing the next generation of American leaders. And if they aren't careful, 20 years from now, when they need support from the American public, it won't be there. So that bears watching, I think, however this Gaza war plays out and whenever it's over. Obviously, an issue that's very important to the Japanese audience, Americans, negative views of China have never been worse. If you took that chart back another 20, 30 years, you would see that even after Tiananmen Square, the negativity among the American public for China was not as bad as it is now. It is far worse than it was even after Tiananmen Square. I think the political ramifications of this are that if a American politician says something negative about China, 8 in 10 Americans will agree with that, whatever the issue is. It's a dangerous time for U.S.-China relations because the public is so anti-Chinese. And that's separate from whether we should be worried about the Chinese on this issue or that issue. But to have such a negative public sentiment about China means that politicians are free to do almost anything against China. and have the public support them. On trade, which for many years was an irritant in US-Japan relations, it's far less of an irritant today. But in general, America's willingness to engage with the world on trade, the sentiment is negative, and it's an ongoing negativity. And it also reflects something we find and have found for years in survey data of Americans' attitudes towards globalization and trade. The American public acknowledges that trade is good for the country. They just don't believe that it's good for them. And I actually wrote some of these questions when I was at the Pew Research Center, and we asked these questions multiple times. Every time, Americans said trade does not create jobs, it does not raise wages, and it does not lower prices. Now, bear in mind that economists don't say that trade creates jobs or raises wages, but economists say nations should trade because it lowers prices. And Americans consistently say they don't believe that trade lowers prices. And in fact, the people who are the most skeptical of trade's benefits are old white men like me. The guys I went to high school with, who went to work in the steel mills as soon as we got out of high school, didn't go to college. Their life did not work out for them as they had hoped. Even though that steel mill in my hometown is still open, it has 1/3 the workers and makes more steel. So it's not imports that have killed those jobs, it's technology, it's productivity. Nevertheless, they, in my hometown, voted 2-1 for Trump. And we know from the survey data, they don't believe that trade has been good for them. And that's one of the challenges we face. It's really one of the reasons why the Biden administration had no major trade initiatives, because there was no support for it among Democratic voters, and actually very, very little support among Republican voters, as witnessed by the negativity of Donald Trump on trade and the threats to impose, pick a number, 20% tariffs on every import, 60% tariffs on Chinese imports, whatever. Okay, the thing that we really want to get down to is who's going to win. I must say, I joke that if I knew I wouldn't be here, I'd be in Las Vegas betting. But uh, the real thing we need to understand is that it's tied. It's been tied for a long time. The numbers fluctuate a bit from day to day. In this New York Times survey that just came out over the weekend, both candidates nationally have 48% support. So that means there's very few votes really to fight over at this point. It is, if you look at this comparison of the Times survey with other polls that were taken recently, some in the same exact time frame, you can see that Harris may be ahead by 3 in a Reuters poll, but a Wall Street Journal poll has Trump ahead by 3. A USA Today poll has Harris ahead by 1. Bear in mind, these are all within the margin of error. All polls have a margin of error. And so effectively, all of these polls showed that the race at the national level for the national vote is the race is tied. What we know from these polls is that men barely 51% support Trump. Women barely 52% support Harris. Whites more likely to support Trump. Blacks and other minorities, Hispanics, Asians, more likely to support Harris. Of course, they far fewer of them than there are of whites. Uh, Among age groups, Harris's strongest support is among people under the age of 30. And Trump's strongest supporters among basically anyone over the age of 50. But even then, it's just barely a majority of that age group. One of the biggest gaps or differences in the electorate is between people with a postgraduate education. 62% of those say they support Harris. And people who only have a high school education or less, 56% of them support Trump. This is one of the uh, divisions in American society that has grown up over the last couple of elections. It's based on education. Um, and you combine that with whether you live in a rural area or suburban area or an urban areas are increasingly Democratic in the United States, rural areas increasingly Republican. And then the suburbs is where the fights take place because that's, what's going to decide the election. Um, Interestingly, pessimists prefer Trump, optimists prefer Harris. For those of you who follow American politics, you'll understand that the national public vote does not determine the outcome of who becomes president. We have this very outmoded system that was designed in 1789, in part to convince some reluctant colonies to join the new country that we were forming in 1789. So it was a political deal that was made that gave smaller states disproportionate influence because those small states were afraid that the big states with greater populations would outvote them. And what it means is that we've created what's called an electoral college that meets to actually elect the president based on the popular vote in each of the states. But it means that in that um, electoral college, Wyoming has 3 electoral votes. Each state has 2 votes because they have 2 senators, and then they get as many votes as they have members of the House of Representatives, which is determined by population. So Wyoming, very small state, has 3 votes. Washington state has 4 times as many votes. It has 2 senators, the votes that are of 2 senators, but also 10 members of the House of Representatives. But Washington has 14 times the population of Wyoming. So it has 4 times as many votes in the Electoral College, but 14 times the population. It's a very unfair system from my point of view, very outdated. Again, a reflection of an 18th century political deal. But what it means is that the election will be determined by a handful of states, the popular vote in a handful of states. As you can see, those are the ones that are in yellow here, or greenish yellow. Nevada, Arizona, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Georgia. The important thing to remember as you watch the outcome of this election, if Harris can win Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, she wins the election. But if she loses even just Pennsylvania, she can't make it up by winning Nevada and Arizona. She would have to win either North Carolina or Georgia as well. So that's why many people believe that she is at an electoral disadvantage in the Electoral College. So what's really important is the polling results in these 6 or 7 states and who's going to win those states. It all comes down to the accuracy of those polls. there were elections held in those states in 2022 for Congress, for a third of the Senate and all of the House of Representatives. They overestimated the, the Republican vote. Polls tended to underestimated the Democratic vote. And if they are off that much, as they were in 2022, when the Democrats did very well, then she wins because the polls aired on the side as they did in 2022. If, on the other hand, the polls err by overestimating the Harris vote and underestimating the Trump vote, as they did in 2020 when Biden won, but they really overestimated by how much he would win, then it looks like uh, Trump could carry these electoral votes from these states. Um, the the dirty little secret of public opinion polling in American elections is that, for reasons we can't fully explain, since 1956, the second Eisenhower election, there have been 18 presidential elections. The public opinion polls have overestimated the Democratic vote in 12 of those 18 elections. They've overestimated the Republican vote in 6 of those elections. So the tendency seems to be, for, again, reasons we don't fully understand, that pollsters overestimate the Democratic margin of victory. So when you see a poll that's tied, if history holds, it means probably that Trump is ahead. And we'll see what happens on election day, but history does suggest that the polls tend to underestimate the Republican vote. Now, I'm sure many of you hope to uh, wake up on Wednesday morning and know who won the election, at least by the evening in Japan. Uh, don't expect that. Most Americans think that it could take weeks for us to know the outcome. As you can see, a third of Democrats, more than a quarter of Republicans say it's going to take at least a week. A quarter of independents think it could take 2 weeks. So I think we're all going to be sitting on, as we say in English, sitting on tenterhooks, waiting for this outcome, and it could take some time. One of the reasons it could take a lot of time is that there have been a historically high number of court cases filed challenging election laws and procedures at the state level. This year to date, and by to date, I mean by the end of September, there had already been 119 court cases filed just in those 10 months and 9 months, actually. 78 of those 119 have been filed by Republicans. So the Republican approach to this seems to be to challenge in the courts. Bear in mind, they only filed 60 cases after the 2020 election. They lost them all, by the way. So you can see there's been a huge increase in the number of cases, mostly by the Republicans. We can expect more court cases after the election, and that will slow the process down as well. And I would say ominously, very ominously, 3 in 4 registered voters don't believe that Trump will accept the outcome if he loses. Now, they could be wrong, but as you can see, basically people expect Harris to accept the outcome if she loses. But Trump supporters don't expect Trump to accept the results. Now, this doesn't mean that all of his supporters themselves would not accept the results, but it does suggest that he would have the expectation is that he will not accept the results. And this, I think, only increases the potential for violence. 3 in 10 Republicans say that violence may be needed to save the country. And if you have Trump not accepting the outcome, assuming he loses, and 30% of his voters say that to change the country, we may need violence, I think that sets the ground for a potential violent outcome after the election, which I must say, as an American, this saddens me because January 6th should never be repeated. And this would suggest that there are a number of people who at least say they might be willing to repeat that. I do think if there is violence, it will not be in Washington, D.C. It will be at the state level, interfering with the counting of votes or interfering with the meetings to determine the Electoral College votes. We'll see, but that's what I would keep my eye on. Finally, whoever wins the White House, we also elected a third of the Senate. We elect the entire House of Representatives. Americans, for reasons that I don't fully understand, seem to like divided government, where they want one of the 3 things they're voting for, the presidency, the Senate, the House, to be controlled by one party, and then other parts of the government are controlled by the other party. I jokingly refer to that as, my father used to say, sometimes you throw the bums out and get new bums. He didn't like politicians, and I think many Americans don't either. But if you look at this chart, in the last 6 elections, we've produced 2 united governments and 4 disunited governments. The first 2 years of the Trump administration, he was able to pass significant tax cuts because he controlled the White House, the Senate, and the House of Representatives. Joe Biden was able to pass the Inflation Reduction Act, the CHIPS and Science Act, and the infrastructure bill because in the first 2 years of his administration, he controlled the House, the Senate, and the White House. To put this in historic perspective, since 1960, in the 10 elections subsequent to 1960, we had 3 instances of divided government. In the next 10 elections, we had 4 instances of divided government. In the last 13 elections, we've had 10 divided governments. And I'll close with this. Assuming we end up with a divided government, and the projections are now that probably the Republicans will win the Senate, the Democrats will regain control of the House of Representatives, and then whoever wins the White House will have a divided government. It will be a prescription for not getting much done. So with that sober message, I look forward to your questions.